Hi again guys, and welcome to another Rivals match on Gran Turismo Sport, and this time I decided to do something a little bit different. We're not necessarily pitting the same rivals in a vehicle sense, but more so in an engine sense, because this, as of course you saw from the title of the video, is a V10 Showdown, in particular in their racing forms, and even more specifically in Group 3 racing forms, because of course these cars do come in different forms, although strangely enough, not the Audi. The Audi only comes in Group 3 form, although I would not be at all surprised if we do end up having maybe a Group 4 version, but more likely the road version of the Audi. Now the three cars in question, of course, all use V10s, but vary quite considerably in size. Any race with a Viper is going to vary quite a bit, considering how much larger it is than most other cars on the road or on the track. And the three cars in question are, of course, the Lamborghini Huracan, the Viper GT3R, and the Audi R8 LMS. So, as we always do, they're in fully tuned form to see what they're like when they're pushed to their absolute limit, and as always we'll break down each car on its own, compare the lap times, and then see how they compare in a top trumps biggest is best style of on-paper points. First up then we have the Audi. Now this vehicle is one which I haven't actually driven for probably 2 or 3 updates, so it's been quite a while since I last drove this car, and I do believe that my experience with the game, but even more so the updates to it, have changed the handling on this car significantly, but thankfully in a good way, because back when I reviewed this car, it was still the kind of vehicle which had similar handling to how it had on GT6, where it was very fast, but could also have a tendency towards snap oversteer and was a little bit too slippery for my taste in vehicles. Now though, it's a lot better, and in fact, as you'll see from the lap times of all three cars, they are surprisingly well matched. Because of course they are all Group 3 cars, so you'd hope that they're well matched, but at the same time, 2 of these vehicles are kind of notorious for being more challenging. I've had multiple comments from people on YouTube and just in the game in messages saying that they'd love to use these cars more, in particular the Audi and the Lambo, but they're just not very forgiving. They're very slippery cars, whereas the Viper is known for being a very forgiving car and a very competitive one, which is kind of ironic given how similar to a hot rod its essential concept is. However, this Audi really did surprise me by how much of an improvement it's had since the updates. In fact, it felt so good that I was expecting it to be the quickest of the 3, whereas going into the match, I thought that it would be the slowest. Now ultimately it was not the quickest of the 3, but all 3 cars are very close. In fact, all 3 did a 1:29 lap. They are that close. Overall, the R8 LMS is a vehicle which has totally changed for me on GT Sport thanks to the updates, and also thanks to some minor changes in tuning, but I think much more so the updates than anything else. It's a car which has gone from a mild recommendation to one which I would definitely recommend checking out if you are a fan of Audi, or even more specifically the R8, because it's so much better now than when I first started playing the game and when I first reviewed it. Either that or my tuning and me are better as well, which of course is also true, you want to improve all the time, but not by that much. I haven't had that much of an improvement on the game to make it change that much, so I do definitely think that the updates have made all the difference for this car. What then about the Viper, the odd one out of the 3 in more ways than one? Well, to show my hand a little bit, I was expecting the Viper to be the fastest of the 3, and it's kind of a spoiler in saying that because I already said that the Audi wasn't, and from the way I worded it, you can kind of guess that the Viper wasn't either, which indicates something very interesting about the next of the 3 cars. Now, the Viper is my go-to car of the 3. It's the car which I like the handling style of the most, not just because it's the most forgiving, but because generally speaking, I prefer front-engine rear-wheel drive cars to mid-engine ones. There are some notable exceptions, stuff like the Zonda for instance. I do prefer that to a equivalent front-engine car 9 times out of 10, although there aren't many front-engine equivalents to something like that. And of course, overall the Viper has a very strong history. and a longer history than both of the others. The Viper has been racing for much longer than the Audi R8 and definitely than the Lamborghini Huracan, but even if you include its predecessor, the Gallardo, the Viper's still been racing for longer than that as well. Now the Viper isn't really a car that's going to surprise you. It's got a massive engine that it's always had, huge torque in particular, because interestingly all three cars have, let's just say, very similar power. And you'll see just how similar in a second when we get to the specs. But overall, the Viper is the surest bet. If you're newer to the game, or just not as experienced with race cars, definitely go for the Viper. They all cost the same anyway, so the Viper is definitely the most forgiving, the most beginner-friendly. Of course, you can still slide around in it. It is a Viper at the end of the day. But it is my go-to of the three, and it will serve you very well. However, that leads us to by far the most intriguing car of the three, for me personally. And that car is, of course, the Lamborghini Huracan GT3, because I went into this match expecting the Audi to be the slowest. As I said earlier, I expected the Viper to be the fastest, and this one I wasn't so sure about. I pretty much automatically assumed, without really deciding to, that it was going to be somewhere in between, because I already decided the other two. That could not be further from the truth, because this car literally went from being the slowest of the three when I initially drove it, to the fastest of the three. Now, of course, you can keep driving cars all day long, and keep making minor tweaks to the tuning, and to your own driving style, and the best of the three will change a lot. Of course, even from driver to driver, the fastest of the three can be totally different. So you can't just drive them all day, you have to draw the line somewhere. But I drove the Huracan first, and it's my belief that when you're doing a rivals match between cars, the car that you drive first always has the disadvantage, because by the time you get to the third one, you've got a nice flow going on the track, and you pretty much know what to do when, even more so than when you just go into the track after not driving there for a while. So what I decided to do was to go back to the Huracan and drive it again, giving it equal measure to the Audi and the Viper. The change that made, plus a very slight change in the initial torque on the diff, made a massive difference, because overall I said that all three cars did a best lap of a 129. That's true. But the initial lap on this Huracan was a 132. Much slower. In fact, not even close, really. Then, I made that slight change to the initial torque, ran it again, and it became the quickest of the three. Now, I would definitely still say that the Huracan is the most challenging, for sure, of the three cars. It's the least beginner-friendly. However, the fact that it was the fastest is still notable. What then about on-paper numbers? Well, let's find out. Now, of course, with these matches, cars within the same class are always going to have certain things in common. They're all in the same category, for instance, so you might as well give none of them a point or all of them a point. Then, of course, you also have the price, which for most Group 4 and Group 3 cars are all the same within their respective category, 9 times out of 10, if not always, so far. So with that in mind, we first of all have the price. All three of them cost 450 grand, so you could give none of them a point, or as I always do, let's just give them a point for the sake of it. So all three cars get an equal point there. Up next though, we have the real massive variation between the three, and of course whenever it comes to engine size, you can pretty much automatically give the Viper the point even if it's up against a Veyron, because it's one of the largest engines in the game. It is the largest engine in GT Sport because the tank car is no longer in there, of course, with that massive 8.4 litre. Now, as I always say, biggest is not always best when it comes to the pure capacity. Rotary engines, for instance, go to prove that 9 times out of 10, but as I said, this is just for the fun of it, top trump style, so we'll give the Viper the point there. Both of the other two have, of course, the Audi developed 5.2 litre V10, and the similarities were even closer when it was the Gallardo. Now there's a little bit more variation, but either way, it doesn't matter too much because the Viper is so much bigger. As far as the class, of course, they are all Group 3, so once again, you could give none of them a point, but let's give them all one anyway. As far as the power, well, as I'm sure you've noticed already before we got to it, I said that they were close, but look how close they are. They're exactly the same, but the difference is the Viper has that power anyway, You cannot make it any higher, whereas the other two cars can be tuned up to that point. You could view that in different ways if you want to, but it's interesting that all three cars have a peak of exactly 692 horsepower, so once again we're giving them all a point. It's a fairly equal match so far, with only the Viper's engine size giving it a slight lead. As far as torque, well, once again, the Viper has a massive advantage there, because V10s aren't typically known for big torque, unless of course they are truck engines, which is what the Viper was, and then ironically reworked by Lamborghini and put into the Viper. So it has a huge torque advantage, over 650 pound-feet. Both of the others are way, way less, with that Viper having, in some cases, such as with the Audi, way in excess of 150 pound-feet more, in fact way beyond that. As far as weight though, speaking of that Audi, the Audi actually wins. I would not have predicted that. I would have thought the Lamborghini was a little bit lighter, but no. The Lamborghini is actually in the middle, the Viper is the heaviest, but only 6 kilos separates all three cars, so once again they are very, very well matched. And as far as the horsepower per tonne, because they all have the same power but the Audi is lighter, of course that point goes to the Audi. But once again, there's not much between them. Only 4 horsepower per tonne separates the best from the worst, so not much of a difference at all. And it's very rare, extremely rare in fact, maybe even never done before in this entire series, that all three cars in a match are that close. That almost never happens. And then, of course, as always, although we don't award it a point, the lap times of the three cars were, for the Huracan, a 1:29.2, for the Viper, a 1:29.4, and for the Audi, a 1:29.8. So extremely close between all three. So, which one wins? Well, if you include all of the equal points, which we will because I gave them those points, the Huracan gets 3 points to its name and is overall the loser, if you want to look at it that way. But then the Viper gets 5 points, as does the Audi. So both the Audi and the Viper are technically this week's winners with 5 points apiece, which is an interesting equality to have between the two. Not exactly cars which you would probably assume would be equal, but if you break it down in a more unique way, that means that the Viper has the largest engine and the most torque, but the Audi is the lightest and has the most horsepower per tonne. So if you look at it that way, the Lamborghini's kind of left to the side a little bit with no significant advantages to its name. Yet, ironically, the biggest advantage of all, it was the quickest of the three, which happens so often in this series, it's not even funny anymore. So, it's an interesting match overall, one which had a completely different outcome to how I expected, and of course all three cars can serve you very well, and can definitely give you victories. So I'd recommend the Viper to pretty much anyone, I'd recommend the Audi to those who fancy a bit more of a challenge, and I'd recommend the Lambo for those who want to totally surprise people, because it proved here today it has the potential to do that, because a lot of people believe that the Huracan is too twitchy to be worthwhile. That's not the case. But overall, that's it for this particular Rivals match. Of course, I'll see you guys next time for another one, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.